Hello, everybody, and welcome to the lecture on nationalism. So this is our final lecture for this course, and through this lecture, we're going to really just wrap everything up that we have covered um, from the start of the course up until now. So first, before we do this, we need to define our terms. So we need to think of, well, what is nationalism? And the dictionary definition of nationalism, as defined by Merriam-Webster, is loyalty and devotion to a nation, especially a sense of national consciousness, exalting one nation above all others, and placing primary emphasis on promotion of its culture and interests as opposed to those of other nations. So nationalism is a sense that is always in comparison with other nations. So nationalism is different from patriotism in the way that patriotism is just love for one's country. You have a pride, you have a love, you have an admiration for your country, but it's not necessarily a sense of being superior or a sense of feeling that you're better than other countries the way that nationalism is. Nationalism is always in comparison with other nations. And nationalism has come to, has developed into an ideology that gives the nation a set, a purpose, and that imposes the same set of identities on all members of that nation. So whether they be linguistic or historical or cultural identities. So this results in like American nationalism taking on a very certain characteristic, or Korean nationalism also taking on a very particular characteristic, or French nationalism also taking on a certain characteristic. But this is, when we look at nationalism, we need to look at the historical context in which we see the nation emerging. And we in the modern times, we tend to just automatically assume that the nation has always existed and that it was always there. But in fact, nations are a modern phenomenon, and the nationalism, which is this sense of loyalty to the nation, is also a modern phenomenon because nations did not always exist. If we look at Europe and we look at the Holy Roman Empire, so this is a map of the Holy Roman Empire from the 17th century, we see that it's broken down to many, many different kingdoms and fiefdoms and confederations, but it all falls under the umbrella of the Holy Roman Empire. And so each one of these different little areas, they all have their own identity and language and culture and traditions, and what unifies all of them is the Roman Catholic Church and their being under the domain of the Pope and the Catholic Church. And so what we see then is out of this, this broken down into many, many different areas, is we begin to see a series of religious wars. So the first is the 30 Years' War, and the 30 Years' War was a war between Protestant and Catholic states in the Holy Roman Empire. And so what we see then is the Holy Roman Emperor Ferdinand II had tried to impose religious uniformity on all of his domains and forcing all of its peoples to practice Roman Catholicism. The Protestants, who were living in places like Sweden, Denmark, and Holland, as well as other places, they rebel against this because they do not want to practice Catholicism. And so this leads to the 30 Years' War in 1618 to 1648. And we also have, overlapping with this, the 80 Years' War, or the Dutch War of Independence. And so this was a revolt of 17 provinces of what are today are known as the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg, as well as certain regions in France. And so they were rebelling against the political and religious hegemony of Philip II of Spain. And so we have this overlapping. And what comes out of these religious wars is the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. So this was a series of peace treaties that were signed in 1648 to end these European wars of religion. And as a result, Spain formally recognizes the independence of the Dutch Republic. There's different peace treaties that are established by a diplomatic congress, and a new system of political order emerges out of this. And this later on becomes to be known as Westphalian sovereignty. It's based on the idea that all of these different coexisting states on the continent of Europe, they are all sovereign. So regardless of your size, regardless of your population and your religion, each state must recognize that other states are sovereign, and then those states will recognize that your state is sovereign. So it's this reciprocity, and it was a way to keep the interstate aggression in check by establishing a balance of power. So there was a norm that was established out of this that was that states do not interfere in other states' domestic affairs, because if you're recognizing the sovereignty of another state, then you're not going to interfere in their domestic affairs. So this is where we begin to see the emergence of states that form into nations. And then we have, in the next century, the French Revolution. So, historians, they always point to the French Revolution as this really significant historical landmark. But what happened during the French Revolution? Well, the French Revolution, and the reason why historians really emphasize the importance of it is because many believe that this revolution paved the way for the modern nation state. So it brought down the old monarchical order and the old aristocracy, the Ancien Regime, and then from this we have the development of a popular nationalism. And so we have the destruction of the traditional power structures, a redrawing of the political map, liberal ideas such as liberty, equality, and brotherhood, these begin to really take shape. And nationalism, the nation state, and national determination, self-determination, these really are an outcome of the French Revolution. And so what we see then coming out of this is an increasing focus on popular sovereignty, on equal representation, the right to vote, freedom of speech, all of these things that we associate with modern democracies today. This is sort of the historical origins of that. So if we look at Europe in the 1700s, so again, this is under the domain of the Holy Roman Empire, and we have that it's really broken down into all of these different areas. And with the Westphalian Treaty, we have the independence of Holland and Sweden and other places. And then by 1871, we begin to see the rise of these nation states, these independent sovereign nation states. And now Europe begins to look more familiar to us. It begins to look a lot more like what we are familiar with modern day Europe today. So, we see the rise of Britain and France and Italy and Russia and Germany, and the independent state and sovereignty. And this is very important that these states then recognize each other as sovereign, that this recognition is reciprocal, and that under this new political order, all nation states are equal and sovereign, and they must mutually respect this. So this is the new political order that is emerging in Europe and in later on in the United States. So in contrast, this is very different from what we learned about how the East Asian system worked. The East Asian system, which was built on the idea of the tributary system, where you have one suzerain country, which is China, which is the top dog, so at the top of the hierarchy, and then these vassal states or these tribute states that pay tribute to China, and they are ranked in hierarchy in terms of their civilization. And so whereas the East Asian system is hierarchical, this system is ostensibly equal. So we have these two very different systems that are in operation. All right, so let's take a look at how nationalism begins to develop in China, Korea, and in Japan, because in all three of these countries we see nationalism taking a different pathway, and what we end up with is very different types of nationalisms. So in China, as you know, again, this story is very familiar to you by now. In the 19th century, Qing China experiences all kinds of difficulties as a result of Western imperialism. There's the first Opium War, the second Opium War. Russia is able to occupy parts of Manchuria. We have the Sino-French War, the Sino-Japanese War, and China is the big loser in all of these wars. And so they are really suffering, and the Qing dynasty, its inability to defend the country is continuously exposed throughout the course of the 19th century. And particularly in the Sino-Japanese War, in the traditional East Asian order, China being at the apex and Japan was considered to be a barbarian. The Chinese did not recognize the Japanese. They just considered them to be this barbarian island nation. But after Japan was opened up and then they modernized their military, the fact that they were able to defeat China in the Sino-Japanese War, this was a huge blow to the Chinese and extremely humiliating. So as a result of the Sino-Japanese War, the Chinese Navy was destroyed. They had to give up Taiwan to Japan. This was when Japan acquired its first full-fledged colony. They had to pay a large indemnity to Japan. And so because of all of these capitulations, it was a huge humiliation for the Chinese, and this is also when we begin to see the formation of the Japanese Empire. Now, as a result of these things, we have great discontent against the Qing court and their inability to, the continued failure to protect the country. And so beginning with peasants in northern China, we see grumblings amongst the commoners. There's, in particular, we have what is called this Boxer Uprising. And the Boxer Uprising actually was anti-foreign and anti-imperialist. So these peasants, they blamed all of the problems that were happening in the Qing dynasty on Westerners, on foreigners. And so they rise up and they receive support from high officials of the Qing court, and they decide to go on a rampage against foreigners. And they particularly attacked Christians and Christian missionaries, and their slogan was support the Qing government and exterminate the foreigners. So what we have then is foreigners and Christians seeking refuge in the legation quarter in Beijing. And because they are under attack, we have the great powers that intervene and they step in. There are 8 nations that step in, including Great Britain, France, Germany, America, Russia, Japan. They all step in to protect their people, and they invade Beijing, and the Chinese forces are not able to defend themselves yet again. So they come to a settlement, and as a result, foreign troops are stationed in Beijing. China again has to pay a huge indemnity, and Russian troops are able to be stationed in Manchuria until about 1905. So we have, instead of the expulsion of foreigners, we have, in fact, more foreigners and more soldiers that are in China as a result of the Boxer Rebellion. This also has an effect on politics and radicalizes politics. So what we have is, those who are trying to just maintain the status quo. These would be those associated with the Qing court, obviously, because they have the most political power and the most to lose if anything were to change. So they want to maintain the status quo, as well as some peasants, many peasants. And then on the other end of the spectrum, there are reformers, and on the far end, revolutionaries. So reformers, they want to reform the system and create a modern style monarchy. And then we have revolutionaries who want to just get rid of the dynasty altogether and establish a republic. But from these revolutionaries, we have a splintering, those that want to go the more capitalist route, and those that want to follow Marxist, leftist, communist type of style. So we have the splintering of politics, and those who, everywhere from those who want things to just remain the same to complete overhaul and change. So in 1911, what we have is the revolution of China, the Chinese Revolution. And this overthrew the last imperial dynasty, the Qing dynasty. The last emperor, the 6-year-old last emperor, he abdicated the throne. And in this revolution, the blame is mostly placed on the Qing state, on their inability to protect the government, protect the country, and their ineffectiveness in terms of modernizing China or confronting foreign powers. And so we have this anti-Qing sentiment that then overthrows the Qing dynasty, and then we have the establishment of a republic in the following year. So through this, we have a provisional government of the Republic of China. Sun Yat-sen was elected as the first president. He's also the founder of the Nationalist Party, or the Kuomintang. And this party is based on 3 principles of the people: nationalism, people's rights, and people's livelihood. So here is where we begin to see the beginnings of Chinese nationalism starting to develop. But with the overthrow of the Qing dynasty and the establishment of this provisional government, we see just the breakdown of China. And again, this should be a familiar story to you because remember, we've discussed the rise and the fall of dynasties, how this is a pattern. And when you have the fall of a dynasty, it just breaks down into all of these different local entities. And this is exactly what we saw between 1913 and 1928. We see the rise of powerful warlords in various regions, and they begin to control their region through military strength. And this era is called the warlord era, and it was a period when the control of the country was divided amongst military cliques. All right. We also see around this time the rise of Chiang Kai-shek, who was born in 1887. He comes from a rather traditional background where he studied Confucianism, but then he also studied military arts in Japan, and then returned during the revolution of 1911, became a follower of Sun Yat-sen, and he later goes on to become the leader of the Nationalist Party, or the Kuomintang. So what we see is at the beginnings is, although China had tried to borrow from the West by importing technology and reforming economic institutions and using science and education, these never really were able to accomplish significant and dramatic enough change. So this results in a frustrated kind of nationalism for the Chinese. And because we have, during the warlord era, China is experiencing continuous civil wars between the warlords. The Western countries are still there and trying to extract as much privilege from China as possible. China is becoming weaker and poorer, and their nationalism becomes more and more frustrated. And so what we see is amongst urban intellectuals is a multiplication of different kind of isms. And this means, capitalism, studying capitalism, or Marxism, or socialism. And so it becomes an environment where there are all these different ideas as to how a new China should look like. And intellectuals are debating amongst themselves as to what this new China should look like. So we get to, this is overlapping with World War I, where China decides to join the Allied forces, and this is more towards the end, the later years of World War I. And at this point, most of the supplies have been exhausted. So many soldiers in Europe have been killed, and so China sends thousands and thousands of laborers to Europe to help with the wartime efforts and to help with the Allied efforts to win the war. And during this time, Japan had driven out German forces out of Qingdao, so they move in and they occupy this area of China after driving out the Germans. And then at the conclusion of World War I, we have the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, and there were high expectations in Beijing because China had participated in the war on the winning side. They figured, all right, so now all of these formerly occupied areas, particularly those areas occupied by Germany that the Japanese had taken over, we should be able to get them back now. They should be repatriated back to us. But in the Treaty of Versailles, all German privileges in the Shandong Peninsula were transferred to Japan. So instead of being repatriated back to China, they were given to Japan. And for the Chinese, this was a huge humiliation. There were student protests in Beijing that were demonstrating against the signing and the results of the Treaty of Versailles. There's a spread of the student movement. They said we should boycott Japanese products. They demanded the release of arrested students. Over time, as this movement spread, workers and merchants joined in, and it spread to other areas, to Shanghai, Nanjing, and even to other parts of the world. So this was a huge movement in protest. And what we have then, shortly after this, is the formation of new political parties. So the Nationalist Party, which was founded by Sun Yat-sen, he dies in 1925. Chiang Kai-shek takes over as the leader. And in 1921, we have the establishment of the Communist Party, with Mao Zedong being one of its founding members. So early on in the 1920s, we begin to see the splintering of Chinese politics and political visions for China. So in 1924, the Kuomintang and the Chinese Communist Party, they merged, but they ended up splitting again in 1927 because the Kuomintang attacked. Under Chiang Kai-shek, they attacked the Communist Party and tried to essentially wipe them out. So, for example, there was the April 12th incident where, and a military campaign between 1926 to 1928, where the Kuomintang wanted to try to unify China under its own control by getting rid of the local warlords and also by getting rid of the Communist Party. So in the April 12th incident, there was a violent suppression of the Communist Party and organizations in Shanghai by Chiang Kai-shek's military forces. And following this, then, the Kuomintang carried out a full-scale purge of the communists in all areas under their control. So as a result of this, we see China sort of under, because if you look at this map here, we have areas controlled by the Kuomintang, which is in these areas here, up here, and then down here as well. And so in these areas, the Japanese, which had been occupying the Shandong province and then also had set up a puppet state of Manchukuo and Manchuria in 1931, and then began encroaching even further into Shanghai, northern China. And then this blows up into full-scale aggression between China and Japan with the Second Sino-Japanese War in 1937. All right, so here we have China under the Kuomintang, and you can see that the Communist Party has been pushed to the periphery of China. There are still these warlords also that are in power, but they are in the communists are in the rural areas, and between 1934 and 1935, the communists, they launch what is called the Long March. They have revolutionary bases in these areas. There are also communist revolts in other areas. So they start the Long March to northwest China in 1934. So to this area over here. And what they intend to do is, this was a military retreat by the Red Army of the Communist Party in China, and it was to try to get away from the Kuomintang and their army. And this included about 130,000 soldiers and civilians. So there are two paths that they took, this path and this path to this area here. And it's during this long march that Mao Zedong was able to solidify his power and rise to the leadership. Mao was the one who founded the Red Army of China, and during the Long March to this area, he wanted to focus on fighting the Japanese from here, so they could fight the Japanese along this front here. And he believed that by focusing on an anti-imperialist struggle, which was anti-Japanese, the communists would be able to earn the trust of the Chinese people, who then would renounce the Kuomintang. So this is his type of nationalism. Nationalism under Chiang Kai-shek. Chiang Kai-shek was perceived to have negotiated with the Western powers and Japan and to have conceded to them. He was able to regain some things that had been lost, such as the right to set tariffs and extraterritorial rights and to revise unequal treaties, but he was also seen as having negotiated and conceded with the Western powers and with Japan. So what we see here is Chinese nationalism. It begins with an anti-Qing movement, and a movement to overthrow the dynasty and then redefine what it means to be Chinese. And so politically, China then disintegrates into turmoil. We have the Nationalist Party, the Communist Party, and all these warlords and civil war. And eventually you have the triumph of the Chinese Communist Party. All right, what is happening in Japan? So in Japan, as you know, we have the Meiji Restoration and a concerted effort to modernize Japan. The young Tokugawa, or the young emperor, which overthrew the previous dynasty, wanted to bring a new sense of national pride to Japan, and felt that the best way to counter Western influence was to modernize, industrialize, and most importantly, militarize. So the focus was on militarization. And as Japan, their feeling of pride in their new strength grew, so did their feelings of nationalism, and they began to compete with Europe in their empire building. And so this sense of pride really begins with the Sino-Japanese War, when Japan defeats China and is able to drive China out of Korea, destroying their navy and gaining a foothold in Manchuria. And then this only increases with their victory in the Russo-Japanese War in 1905. And so we see that Japan, to the surprise of the international community, was able to defeat Russia, which was a much bigger country with a much bigger population. And so this was really a shock to everybody, and it really gave the Japanese a sense of pride. It is well documented in these kinds of paintings. What we see here is a picture of Japanese imperialist soldiers, and they are tending to wounded Russian soldiers and giving them medical treatment. And this is in contrast to what we see in this little box here, where we have Russian soldiers who are abusing Japanese peasants. And here is the Japanese Navy destroying the Russian Navy. And after defeating Russia, Korea then becomes a protectorate of Japan, and by 1910, Japan fully annexes Korea. All right, so between the world wars, because of the difficult economic times in Japan caused by the Great Depression, there was a lot of blame that was placed on the government. And so the military leaders were able to gain support and to gain political influence and control. And so we see Japan's empire expanding with the acquisition of Taiwan, Korea, Manchuria, and then other areas in Southeast Asia. As Japan's empire grows, so does its sense of nationalism. And Japan's military looks to solve their economic problems through expansion and imperialism. So when Japan invaded Manchuria, they withdrew from the League of Nations and then decide to go further into China. So they start invading northern China, and the Chinese are unable to defend themselves. There are northern cities such as Beijing and Nanjing that were seized, and tens of thousands of captured soldiers, women, and children were slaughtered in 1937 to 1938. There was the rape of Nanjing. These are in fact just so horrific and so brutal that I have chosen not to include a picture, an image from this time period. You can just look it up on the internet, but it was really just terrible. And then Japan's imperialism comes to an end with the end of World War II and their defeat in the war by the Allied powers. And as a result, the Americans go into Japan and occupy Japan, and Japan becomes demilitarized. So what we see in Japan is a different kind of nationalism that develops. So it starts in response to Western threats, but they are successful in setting up a new government, in industrializing, in militarizing, and in creating their own empire. So their Japanese sense of nationalism is tied to imperialism and expansionism. This is very different from what we just saw in China. All right, so this concludes part one of our look of nationalism, and in part two, we're going to look at Korean nationalism.